today. Delighted to welcome you, and I'm also delighted to welcome Matt Bain here at MJ Bushell. Matt's client manager, but he's also our R&D tax specialist. So just to give you a bit of background, Matt's worked in R&D for the last 3 years, and over that time has successfully completed lots of claims from small companies up to large companies, from small claims up to large claims. So delighted that you can join us, Matt. I'll hand over to you in just a second, but just a couple of housekeeping issues to cover first of all. We have allowed time at the end of the presentation today for an open Q&A session. What I would suggest, if everybody could just check your Zoom toolbar, you'll see the Q&A option. Click on that, and if you'd like to ask a question, post your question using that tool, and I'll be back at the end to field those questions out to Matt. We'll try and answer as many as we possibly can before we get to the end of this session. So I will disappear at this point, hand over to Matt, and see you at the end. Over to you, Matt.
Cheers, Jo. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. It's great to have you with us. This is our Introduction to R&D webinar. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about research and development claims, how the claims work, how you can successfully submit a claim, then you're in the right place. In this presentation, we're going to go through some of the basics of R&D. We're going to look at 2 of the schemes that you can submit R&D claims through, and some of the technical criteria that HMRC look for in an R&D claim. And then we're also going to look at some calculation examples to give you an idea of the tax relief that you can benefit from by making a claim. So I'll start off with a little bit of the background of research and development claims. This was introduced in 2000 by HMRC. And its aim is to help support businesses that are innovative and carrying out advances in science and technology. The government wants to encourage this type of innovation. So one of their ways to do that was introducing this really beneficial tax relief scheme called R&D. So some of the basic criteria that you need in order to be eligible is you have to be a limited company, you have to be a going concern, and you have to be subject to UK corporation tax. If you meet those first basic criteria, then you're going to be eligible for R&D, depending on if you're carrying out qualifying R&D projects, which we'll move on to in a moment. But to give you an overview of the basic tax benefits you can expect, the way it works is by submitting a successful R&D claim, you're going to either reduce your corporation tax liability that your limited company has to pay, or you're going to get a tax credit payout from HMRC, and that is around if your company is loss-making. We'll look at some calculation examples towards the end of the presentation so you can see how both the reduction of corporation tax or the cash tax credit would work for you. Now, the way an R&D claim is submitted is it's submitted alongside your company's CT 600 or your company's corporation tax return. So what we would do is we would prepare a research and development claim report. You need a robust report that would be attached alongside your corporation tax return in order for you to achieve the tax relief. This final point here, talking about the deadline for R&D claims, is a really important one to take note of. There's a really strict cut-off point for submitting R&D claims, which is 2 years after your company's last financial year end. So if you miss this cut-off, then you miss getting the R&D tax relief for previous financial years. So if you are looking to make R&D claims for your company, or maybe you've got clients who have an interest in submitting R&D claims, it's important that you get started on this as soon as possible so that you don't miss claims that you can submit for previous financial years. So looking at the two basic R&D schemes that you can submit claims through, we've got the first scheme, the SME scheme, which stands for Small Medium Enterprise Scheme. Now, this is the most common and it's also the most beneficial in terms of tax relief. In order to be eligible for this scheme, you need to have fewer than 500 employees and a turnover of less than 100 million euros and a balance sheet total of less than 86 million euros. So that encompasses most companies. The enhancement rate for this scheme is any qualifying R&D costs that you identify, you'll get to enhance them by an additional 130%. And then that flows into reducing your corporation tax at a rate of 19%, or if you're loss making, can turn into a tax credit of 14.5%. Again, we'll look at some calculations later on where you'll be able to see how this works. The second scheme that you can make a claim through is called the RDEC scheme. That stands for Research and Development Expenditure Credit Scheme. Now, this scheme is normally for large companies that are carrying out R&D. So this is companies that have 500 employees or more, or a turnover of more than 100 million euros and balance sheet total of more than 86 million euros. This is still a really beneficial tax relief. It's just not as beneficial as the SME scheme. So for this one, you'll get an above the line tax credit of 13%, which is slightly less than the SME, but it's still well worth submitting a claim for. Now, there are cases where a small company might make an R&D claim through the RDEC scheme instead of the SME scheme. There's certain circumstances where that might happen, and I'll touch on one of those at the end of the presentation, which is around whether or not you've received grant income towards your R&D project. So what does HMRC define as R&D, and what do they look for when you make an R&D claim? This illustration here is a really clear outline of the 5 things that HMRC look for when you make an R&D claim. So they look for a field of science and technology that you are trying to achieve an advance in, and the advance has to be above the industry baseline for that science or technology. In addition to that, they're looking for some sort of technical challenge that you're going to be facing in order to achieve that advance. And lastly, they're looking for you to have at least one competent professional who is leading the R&D project and making decisions around the methods, the tests that you're carrying out, the activities you're carrying out in order to try and achieve the advance that you're seeking. So we're going to look at a few of these criteria in a little bit more detail. The first one being, what is a project? So this is a big question most people ask. What type of project would qualify in HMRC's opinion as R&D? So HMRC's definition of an R&D project is a number of activities conducted to a method of or plans in order to achieve an advance in science or technology. So as we've already said, what HMRC are looking for is they're looking for you to be carrying out a number of activities to achieve a specific advance in a specific science or technology. And as already stated, that advance has to be above the industry baseline or the industry's knowledge at that present point in time. So one misconception that some people have with R&D is that it can't be part of a larger commercial project. And I thought it'd be really good to mention this point. Your R&D can be within a revenue generating commercial project that your company is carrying out. For example, if you have agreed with a customer to provide a service to them for a fixed fee, then you go away as a company and you take on the risk of having to figure out how to provide that service. Now, within providing that service, you might have to go away and carry out a specific R&D project to achieve some sort of advance in that field, in that science or technology, in order to produce the desired product or service you've promised to the customer at a fixed fee. So there are R&D projects that you can be carrying out that can be part of a larger commercial project. Another really good point to mention is that HMRC aren't looking for open-ended, ambiguous R&D projects in your claims. They're looking for clearly defined R&D projects. So you need to be able to say, this is the background of why we want to carry out this research and development. This is the advance we're seeking. These are the uncertainties we faced, and these are the steps that we took to try and achieve that advance. And if possible, they'd like to see a start point for when that project started, and if known, an end point as well, although not all R&D has a known end point, which is completely fine. Moving on to technical advances, this is another criteria that HMRC look for in a successful claim. So what constitutes a technical advance? In the basic definition, a true technical advance is where the outcome of the project must represent an overall increase in worldwide knowledge in an area of science or technology. That can be a really small increase. It doesn't have to be a massive increase, but there needs to be some sort of advance that's happening. However, you can break down the definition of a technical advance into some subsections. So I've listed those below because there's some really helpful definitions here that can lead to you understanding that your company could be eligible for R&D. So there's the obvious ones at the start, which is seeking to extend overall knowledge in a field of science or technology, seeking to create a new process, material, device, product, or service. Then the last two are the interesting ones, where you can be seeking to make an improvement to an existing process through scientific or technological change. And then the fourth one, seeking to duplicate an existing material, device, product, or service in an improved way using science or technology. These last 2 points are really beneficial to take note of. I've had lots of claims that I've done for companies where they're not creating something completely new under the sun, but they are taking modern science technology and an old existing process or an old existing material, device, product, or service, and they're improving it in some way. Maybe they're making the cost of building it less expensive. Maybe they're making the manufacturing process more efficient, or maybe they're coming up with a new way of delivering the same service, but in a more timely manner as well. So there's lots of ways that you can actually be achieving an advance by simply appreciably improving something that's already in existence. Lastly, a really important one to look at as well is technological uncertainty. So HMRC also, for a successful R&D claim, look for there to be some sort of technological uncertainty within the R&D project. Now, what that means is simply that a project has a technological uncertainty if the competent professional that's working on the project cannot say whether the advance is technically feasible at the outset of the project. So what that means is that someone who's competent in that field of science or technology doesn't have an answer, doesn't have a solution straight away for the advance that you're seeking to achieve. Instead, they're saying, well, we might be able to make this technically feasible, but we're going to have to carry out some research. We're going to have to carry out some activities to see whether we can achieve this. If that's the case, then you're ticking the box and you're gonna have an eligible R&D claim. Another few points here that are good to take note of is that if the advance that you're trying to achieve the solutions available in the public domain, then you're not going to have an eligible R&D project. So if you can go onto Google and find the answer, then you're not going to be able to submit a successful R&D claim. Similarly, though, or not similarly, if you're aware that there's a competitor company that's achieved the advance that you're seeking to achieve, but they haven't made that advance public knowledge, maybe they've kept it as a protected trade secret, then you can still carry out the same research and development to try and achieve the same advance, and that would still be eligible for R&D. So moving on now onto some R&D activities. This is just a really helpful list for you to run through to give you an idea of what type of activities relating to an R&D project would have elements of qualifying costs within them. So the red routine ones are activities that won't be eligible for R&D. So that's stuff like cosmetic design. If you're improving the cosmetic design, the aesthetics of a product, those costs aren't going to be eligible for R&D. Same with marketing, marketing a new product you've created. All of that is kind of focused on revenue generation and won't fall into HMRC's qualifying costs. And lastly, registering patents as well is dealt with separately, and you can't claim any costs in your R&D claim for registering patents. It's important to note, if you do have patents, you can benefit from another tax relief called the patent box. And if that's something that applies to you, then feel free to reach out and we can discuss that as well. But some things that are eligible: project management, carrying out experiments and trials, indirect activities like payroll and cleaning if they relate to R&D project specific work, interpreting results, running machinery used for trials, IT support. All of these will have elements of qualifying costs. So moving on to what costs will qualify in an R&D claim. We've got a number of costs here. The main ones that will likely apply to you and most companies making a claim are going to be staff costs. This is where you say that 40% of this employee's time was spent on the R&D project this year. And then you can claim a proportion of their gross salary, a proportion of any employer's national insurance and any employer's pension costs that you've incurred as a company. Second, you've got externally provided workers. This is similar to staff costs, but is restricted to only be able to claim 65% if they're an externally provided worker. Then you've got raw material costs. That's any costs involved in producing prototypes as part of your R&D project. Any wasted material costs in that process of carrying out tests or trying to develop new products, then all of that can be claimed. You've also got software costs, so that's any software that you use that specifically relates to the R&D project. You might have, for example, CAD design software, or even some sort of platform software that you're subscribed to that you might use a proportion of the time towards carrying out R&D. Again, you've got utility costs. So if you're in an office building or a warehouse, you can claim a percentage of your power, light and heat towards R&D, depending on how much you need to have some sort of reasonable calculation for how you choose your proportion. Then clinical trials, and lastly, subcontracting costs, which is any third-party subcontractor you might contract to do some specific R&D related work for you. You're allowed to claim a max of 65% of those costs. And then lastly, you've got contributions to independent research, and that just applies to large companies only, and specifically large companies giving to qualifying bodies such as universities to carry out research and development for them. So those are some examples of qualifying costs. Now we're going to move on, lastly, just to run through some calculations to give you an idea of how the tax relief works and how much you can benefit from making an R&D claim. So you'll see here that we've got up top a few qualifying costs that we've identified. So the first row, we have staff costs of £125,000, and we've identified that 40% of that time relates to R&D projects, qualifying R&D projects. So that equals £50,000 eligible R&D costs. Next line, we've got raw materials, £100,000, 25% of which relates to qualifying R&D. Below that, software, £5,500, 100% R&D. And lastly, subcontractor costs, £30,000, 100% relating to R&D. But as mentioned, this gets restricted to 65%. So it equals £19,500 of eligible costs. And surprise, surprise, we have £100,000 of eligible R&D as a result of identifying these costs. Now, under the SME scheme, the Small Medium Enterprise Scheme, this £100,000 then gets given an additional R&D enhancement of 130%. So you now have £230,000 of R&D costs, £130,000 of which is additional enhancement. So how does this then translate into your tax return? Down below, I've got a column here that shows your tax return and your tax liability if you didn't make a claim. So I've come up with a total figure of taxable profits of £400,000. And because you're not making a claim, oh, sorry, let's take it back. Let's skip forward one slide. If you're not making a claim, you're going to have to pay corporation tax at 19% on that £400,000, which equals £76,000. But if you do make an R&D claim, you're allowed to reduce your taxable profits by this additional £130,000 enhancement, which means that you now only have to pay corporation tax on £270,000, which at 19% equals £51,300. So you can see that by identifying an R&D project with £100,000 of qualifying R&D costs, you actually managed to reduce your corporation tax liability for the year by £24,700, which, when broken down, is 24.7p for every £1 of qualifying R&D that you identify. So it's really beneficial. As you can see, it's actually the best tax relief that a limited company can receive from HMRC. And this example is for a profit-making company. Next, we'll move on to a loss-making company and just show you how the calculation for a loss-making company would work. So as you can see up top, we still have the £100,000 of qualifying R&D that we've identified. We then get the additional £130,000, which gives us a total of £230,000 of R&D costs. Now, translating this down below, for this example, I've made the company loss-making. So I've given them taxable losses in the year of negative £400,000. Now, in this left-hand column, you'll see that without making an R&D claim, you would have taxable losses of £400,000, and these would simply get carried forward to your next financial year to hopefully offset against any future profits that the company makes. So once the company makes profits next year or the year after that, that £400,000 will get offset against those profits, and you'll essentially receive 19% corporation tax relief once the company makes profits. However, a lot of companies want to submit an R&D claim and get a cash tax credit paid out to them straight away. And that's the option that HMRC gives loss-making companies making R&D claims. They allow the company to surrender losses. Any R&D losses can be surrendered for a tax cash credit at 14.5%. So to show you how this works, in this right-hand column, you'll see the £400,000 of losses. You'll receive the additional £130,000 of enhanced R&D costs, which then gives you £530,000 of taxable losses. Now, this company has decided to surrender the full £230,000 of losses, R&D losses, in order to receive a cash tax credit at 14.5%, which gives the company £33,350 cash paid out by HMRC to them within 1 to 3 months of submitting the claim. You can see now that by surrendering those losses, the company only now carries forward £300,000 of tax losses instead of, without making a claim, £400,000. But instead of carrying forward increased losses, they've received this cash payout, which can improve the company's cash flow and help them continue to operate while they're in this loss-making position. So I hope that makes sense, and you can see that you're surrendering the difference between 14.5% and 19% corporation tax relief to get that earlier cash payout. So finally, the last slide is just touching on grant income or grants that you've received towards any R&D projects. We have a lot of clients that have received SMART grants, Innovate grants from the government, which count as notified state aid. There's two types of grants, notified state aid and non-notified. If you've received a grant towards your R&D project, then it affects whether or not you can make a claim through the SME scheme. So in most cases, if you've received any sort of grant that you've used to spend out on any R&D project, then it pushes you into having to make a claim through the RDEC scheme, which is the less beneficial R&D scheme. The final point I wanted to make note of is that this year, some businesses have received the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme and the Bounce Back Loan. And as far as we are aware, these count as notified state aid, which means that if you've received these types of loans and used that money towards qualifying R&D projects, then those projects may not be eligible for the SME scheme now. You might have to make a claim through the RDEC scheme. So if that does apply to you, feel free to reach out and we can discuss that with you in more detail and let you know how that will affect you. That wraps up the presentation. If you have any questions or if you want to get in touch, then please do so. I think we're going to move on to question and answers now. So I'll pass back to Joe just to kind of steer those questions that we might have got.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was extremely interesting. So we've had a couple of questions come in. One relates to a point you made earlier on in the presentation, which was if another company has achieved the advance, but how they've done it is not in the public domain, then would a competent professional say that it therefore must be feasible, obviously, to make a claim on that?
Yeah. So if the solution to the advance isn't in the public domain, then you as a company can carry out the same R&D project, and that can be eligible for an R&D claim. You will need a competent professional working on the advance, but there's a difference between a competent professional saying something's feasible and something's not feasible. If the competent professional can see that another company has achieved it, then great, you're able to say it's feasible, that's fine, you're allowed, but is it going to take you time to achieve that feasible advance? Is there going to be an uncertainty as to whether you can achieve it? And there is still a lot of, there's still going to be a lot of work that your competent professional and your R&D team will have to carry out to achieve the advance, even with them knowing that it's probably feasible because they've seen another company do it. But you're still going to be facing the uncertainties of whether or not your team can actually achieve the same advance, even if you can see another company's achieved that advance. I hope that kind of answers that question. If it hasn't, then please submit a follow-up question and I can try and answer that for you as well.
I've got a yes, that's brilliant, thank you. So you've answered it.
Right.
Okay. A question here from Rose. What happens if your project does not deliver its intended objective? Can you still claim? Yes,
that's a really good point, and thanks for bringing that up. So your R&D project doesn't have to be successful in order for it to be eligible and for you to receive the R&D tax relief. In fact, HMRC like to see projects that don't achieve the advance sometimes, because it shows that you're actually carrying out true research and development. There's plenty of projects that don't succeed, but you still incurred the cost of trying to achieve the advance, and therefore you can still submit a claim and qualify for the relief. Yeah.
And one final question we've got here. Presumably a loss-making company could make the claim that you showed in your example and carry forward the loss, in this case of 530,000, rather than take the credit.
Yes. So if you want, just bringing up the example again, if you wanted to, you can submit the claim, receive the extra £130,000 R&D enhancement, and then you could simply choose to carry forward the £530,000 loss instead of surrendering the loss for a cash payout. Some companies will do this, but only if they expect to start making profits in the near future. If you're not sure, if it's uncertain, you could be sitting there for years with this huge carry forward tax loss and not receive any sort of relief because your company is not making any profit. So a lot of companies will choose to surrender the loss just to get that reduced tax credit, which will help their cash flow and actually give them some sort of relief straight away, albeit at a reduced rate, 14.5% instead of 19%. Yeah, so you have the option. You can choose which one you want.
Okay, that's great. And a response from the person who answered the question there to say understood, and that's perfect. So thank you, Matt. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you very much, Matt, for a very informative presentation. Really enjoyed that. We have recorded this session, so we will create an edited version and place that onto our website, possibly later today, possibly first thing in the morning, and you're more than welcome to access that on-demand version. And of course, if you've got any further questions about how Matt and the team at MJ Bushell can help with anything R&D related, or indeed anything tax related, then don't hesitate to get in touch. Matt's details are on the screen now, along with the contact number. So thank you, Matt, and we look forward to our next webinar.